Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Meg Terrell.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, June 15th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
A handsomely funded startup billed as Moderna 2.0 ran into behind-the-scenes problems with its scientific data. Stat's Allison DeAngelis joins us to share her reporting on a cautionary tale in biotech.
And Biogen is in the news. Again, we'll discuss the boardroom scandal that has roiled a company that was supposed to be entering a new era.
We'll also talk about the latest news in the life sciences.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
What does operational inefficiency look like in clinical trials? For sponsors, it means lagging patient recruitment and no way to see enrollment barriers. At research sites, it looks like manual paperwork jamming the enrollment process. One study team's mission is to accelerate the development of new and life-saving therapies by bringing clinical workflows online. This enables sites, sponsors, and stakeholders to work together on a common cloud-based platform, Study Team. The result? Efficient workflows, increased enrollment, visibility into enrollment barriers, and one clear path to faster therapeutic development. Learn more at onestudyteam.com/stat. That's ONE studyteam.com/stat.
So as we speak, I feel like I have some version of this phrase on the podcast every week now, which is that something is happening, and when you listen to it, you may know, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not even going to try it because temporal reality is escaping me at the moment. As we speak, there is an FDA meeting taking place with implications for the ongoing response to COVID-19. Meg, what is happening?
Yeah, the FDA's panel of vaccine advisors is talking today about what the COVID boosters should look like in the fall. And I think we're planning on really deep diving into this next week. So essentially right now, we just wanted to acknowledge that this is happening, but then get to the rest of our episode because we have two extremely interesting stories to discuss that we want to take a little more time on. So I'm just going to turn it over to you guys on the Biogen story because I was coming back from Boston, actually, from interviewing the CEO of Biogen, Chris Viehbacher, when the news hit that there were going to be major changes on Biogen's board. Adam, walk us through what the changes are first.
Right. Yeah, this was a sort of a shocking news announcement that Biogen issued late on Monday night. The company said that its longtime, sort of polarizing director, an investor by the name of Alex Denner, was going to be stepping down from its board. And, at first it seemed like that would be sending a kind of a signal to investors that, a lot of the problems that the company's had and the strife that the company's had on its boardroom might be coming to a close. However, named as Alex Denner's replacement on the board was a biotech executive by the name of Susan Langer, who just happens to be Alex Denner's live-in romantic partner and the mother of his child, which Damian and I guess we reported that exclusively, Damian, based on information that we had gathered. The fact is, it's a kind of a messy situation. Alex Denner leaves the board of Biogen. He names his own replacement to the board, who just happens to be his romantic partner. Alex is also in the middle of a protracted divorce from his wife of nearly 25 years. Susan Langer is also sort of a contentious issue within that divorce, which is still ongoing. So again, lots of mess. You sort of thought that Biogen had sort of turned the page with a new CEO, Chris Viehbacher. Things were kind of going in a new positive direction. And then here we have this budding boardroom scandal.
And it was interesting watching the reaction evolve to this news because the initial reaction among people who didn't know the backstory of Susan Langer's connection to Alex Denner was, this is a refresh. This is a new start. There had been a lot of concerns that, the board was not interested in allowing Biogen to do deals. That was something that Wall Street wanted perhaps to see. And I heard from people, I was sort of curious. I wasn't going around telling people about the connection myself, but I was just asking people what they thought of the changes. And the responses I was getting back was fresh start, and I saw some analyst notes to that effect. But then, the news came out, Endpoints reported the relationship. You guys came out with the story with much more background about it and revealed more details for the first time. And I think people have just wondered, why wasn't there disclosure here? Damien, what did you guys learn from people about the appropriateness of how Biogen just handled the disclosures of that relationship?
Yeah, it's one of those things. I spoke to a few professors of law specifically who study corporate governance. And at least legally, there doesn't seem to be an issue here because Langer is not conflicted in the sense that she's not a non-independent board member. If she had a romantic relationship with, for example, someone in the management team of Biogen, that would be a problem legally. But it gets down to kind of a letter of the law versus spirit of the law thing. And the point that was made to me multiple times is that the not disclosing this, one, it kind of violates a principle in this stuff, which is like the reasonable person doctrine. Would a reasonable person, in this case a shareholder, think that this information was important before making a decision as to whether to elect this person to the board of Biogen? I think we as reasonable people could conclude that such a reasonable person might think that this information was important. But then more broadly, board members are fiduciaries. Like now we're kind of getting into the theory of publicly traded companies, but briefly, they're fiduciaries. They act on behalf of shareholders in terms of making decisions for the company. And so the most integral thing imaginable is trust. If I'm a shareholder, I have to believe that each member of this board is behaving in a trustworthy manner. And so I don't want to say conceal, but to omit this information from the documents that Biogen put forward in nominating Langer to the board, I think, again, I don't know who this imaginary reasonable person is, but anyway, I think it's reasonable to say that trust was not upheld. And then, getting beyond the personal connection to Alex Denner, I think that, Susan Langer is a 32-year-old who has worked in biotech for since college and worked at Biogen for some time and been involved in a few startup companies since leaving Biogen in 2019. I don't think it is, again, taking away all of the personal connection to a board member who's already there. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that those qualifications are not comparable to the qualifications and the experience of the other members of Biogen's board. Langer has not been a board member of a publicly traded company ever before. 32 is, she'd be 2 decades younger than anyone else on the board. So then when you add in the undisclosed connection to Alex Denner, I think that's where, we spoke to some former Biogen executives. That's where their shock was a word that came up quite a bit, comes from with respect to this announcement. And then I think there was kind of a sense of embarrassment. When you zoom out, it looks, what's the word? It looks unprofessional, I guess.
Tawdry?
To people.
Tawdry? Is that the word?
I don't know. I want to be careful about choosing adjectives. Not good is one I think it fairly boils down to. And I think, zooming out with Biogen, it's a very influential company. It's been around for a long time. It's one of the original biotech companies. It's a linchpin of the Cambridge biotech sector, which is or cluster, which is the biggest one in the world. And as a result, it has employed a lot of people in biotech who either no longer work there or bounce back and forth, as Langer herself has. And those people have, the way one person put it to me, reporting out a different story about a different kind of embarrassing thing Biogen had done years ago, is that it's like your college sports team. You will always root for them. They do things that make you cringe. You get upset. You talk to your fellow alma mater, your fellow alumni about whatever it is that's bothering you. But there's a desire among a large group of people for Biogen to succeed, to do well, to maintain its independence, and to right the ship after the sort of disastrous last 5 years. And so something like this just feels like a setback, I think, in the minds of a lot of people of like, things were supposed to be different now.
Yeah, and we talked to people inside Biogen, who expressed frustration to us because I think they genuinely felt like the company is starting to move in a better direction. That the appointment of Chris Viehbacher as the CEO has been, people have been happy with what he's said and what he's done in early on in his tenure. And inside the company, I think there was a feeling that this is, again, a fresh start. I think they see the board refresh that you mentioned, Meg, as another positive move. But a lot of this seems to maybe at risk of being unraveled or overwhelmed by this sort of personal relationship between Alex Denner and Susan Langer, and that conflict and sort of the lack of disclosure. And I think that's something that that when people who spoke to us, expressed frustration over.
What did Biogen's PR department tell you guys when you knocked on the front door, about what it knew about the situation and how it decided to share the information?
Maybe we should share a little bit of, a little inside baseball about all of this. We all knew about the relationship that Alex Denner was having with Susan Langer. We've known about it since last year. We've known about the divorce since last year. It's information that we had heard about. Damien and I, you and I, obtained the divorce court records that mentioned Susan Langer in there. This is information that was publicly available. We obtained, but we never wrote about it because we don't tend to write about personal matters, and that information was not germane to our biotech coverage. So it's just information that we had at our disposal, but I literally filed the papers in a desk drawer, and that's where they sat until Monday night. All of that information became very relevant to our coverage of Biogen, and that's what that formed the story that we reported on Tuesday morning. And yeah, getting back to what you said, but yeah, we did. Yeah, obviously we went to Biogen and asked them for comment, and I think that they told us that they knew about that Biogen knew about the relationship. I don't know if they knew the extent of what happened, and I don't know if they knew about the child or how sort of nasty the divorce was between Alex and his wife. We asked them, we wanted to know why they chose not to disclose any information about the relationship between Alex and Susan. We felt like that was something that was really important. We wanted to understand maybe whether it's there was some legal doctrine or legal opinion that that Biogen's attorneys had given the company and the board, why that wasn't something that should have been disclosed. And they have not provided us yet with any explanation.
One person I was talking with just about their reactions to this story pointed out, if Cerisi Capital, which is Alex Denner's fund, had nominated Susan Langer to Biogen's board as the sort of designee from the fund, which owns, some significant amount of the stock, while disclosing perhaps the relationship, that may have been considered, whereas people might have noted the relationship and maybe talked about it or whatever, at least it would have all been disclosed and it would have perhaps made sense to folks and everything would have been really upfront. That didn't happen. I mean, do you guys think there's any situation in which this could have been done in a way that people would not have reacted the way they are?
I think that what you just described, I think the reaction definitely would have been less negative. As I said before, I think, one could question Langer's qualifications just as a board member for a company the size of Biogen with operations around the world and et cetera, et cetera. But the absence of the perceived concealment of the relationship, I think, would improve things. I think the tenor of the reaction that I've seen publicly even is really driven by the perception that this is Alex Denner and by extension Biogen kind of trying to get something over on the public. And that doesn't sit well with people. And again, we've kind of hinted at sort of the boardroom dysfunction for this company, but it is quite a serious thing. I mean, going back to Carl Icahn's activist challenge of Biogen more than a decade ago, this is a board that people have said has been factionalized for many years. And this refreshment that people, shareholders and just the broader, biotech community wanted to see from Biogen was a very legitimate thing. And so that factionalization was largely broken down to Alex Denner on one side with some acolytes and Stelios Papadopoulos, the longtime chairman of Biogen, on the other side. Stelios is leaving the board this year because he has reached the company's mandatory retirement age. So the news that Alex was leaving alongside two other board members who had been party to that kind of dysfunction was initially received really warmly. And so I agree with you, Meg, that I endorse the notion that you put forward that even if they had nominated Langer with the proper disclosures, and if it accompanied the fact that Stelios is going and Alex is going and Richard Mulligan is going, I do think that would have been perceived much better. But I mean, that's an opportunity that they missed.
One other element of this is who Susan Langer is. I mean, she has her own qualifications and her own experience in the biotech world. Her dad also happens to be Bob Langer, a very famous inventor and founder of biotech companies, who most recently has been associated with Moderna as one of the founders of that company. And so, of course, there's a lot of coverage of her connection to him in the biotech world. And I think this gets you into really thorny areas because you don't want to imply that a young woman like this has only accomplished what she's accomplished because of her family. At the same time, it's hard to not acknowledge what I think some people would probably call, biotech royalty. Bob Langer is, one of the premier names in this world. So how does that play into all of this?
It is, it's a sensitive topic, Meg. I think you're right. I think we try to report the story, not trying to trash Susan Langer and not, and trying to sort of present her as she is. And, we spoke to people who worked alongside her at Biogen at various times when she was there, who actually had very positive things to say about her. Said she was just really intelligent, she did a great job. But with all that said, they just felt like, as Damien mentioned, that her experience and her qualifications to date really sort of fall short of the threshold that would be necessary to be a director at a company the size of Biogen. It's all sort of tangled up in this sort of mess right now.
And looking forward, that mess, I guess, will come to a head on June 26th when, another messy aspect of this that we didn't mention. This disclosure on Monday came 2 days before Biogen's scheduled annual shareholder meeting, where shareholders were going to vote on the slate of candidates running for the board. That slate changed 2 days before, new person added to it. As a result, Biogen pushed back that vote until June 26th, which is to say that is when shareholders will vote on all of the board members who are standing for election, including Susan Langer. And I don't know which way that's going to go. There is a firm called PrimeCap, which is Biogen's largest shareholder. We heard from someone familiar with the situation that PrimeCap did not look fondly upon the Langer nomination and may not vote in favor of her. They control about 10% of Biogen shares, and Biogen's bylaws are such, this is kind of in the weeds, but they're such that if a shareholder doesn't vote, that vote is not counted in favor of management's recommendation, which is to say that Biogen needs to proactively convince the majority of its shareholders to vote in favor of the slate, including Susan Langer. The company's other large shareholders are mutual funds. We, or at least I, do not know what they are thinking about this, but that's the next step, I suppose, for Biogen on this rocky path toward returning to some kind of normalcy. Is whatever people think about this situation, it would be better for the company to not have its proposed board member rejected by shareholders. And so, we can imagine that Biogen is working the phones for the relevant voters and the relevant shareholding blocks to try to get this through.
It's like Succession.
As someone straining not to compare reality to prestige television, I unfortunately have no choice but to admit that it is kind of like Succession, yeah.
A very high-profile biotech startup founded by the same VC firm that started Moderna has been roiled by data integrity issues, forcing it to shelve 2 lead drug programs. Dozens of employees have left the company, including some top executives.
The company is called Laronde, and it was founded to develop a new class of medicines based on a technology called endless RNA. This week, our stat colleague Allison DeAngelis, with an assist from the Boston Globe, published an eye-opening investigation into Laronde. Soon after the company raised $400 million in private financing, staffers started to question its foundational preclinical research. The data were too perfect and could not be replicated.
Laronde blamed a single scientist for producing the suspect data, and she quietly left the company. But other staffers said pressure to produce positive data was intense. Executives dismissed problems, ignored concerns, while pitching Laronde's vision to outside investors. Allison joins us now to talk about the Laronde saga and her story and its broader implications. Allison, welcome back to the Readout Loud.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with some background on Laronde? And it's, for some reason, I keep trying to pronounce it with a French accent. But I did actually look up what it means. It means the round, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, and it's endless RNA technology. So maybe explain what that is. Insiders, we understand, referred to the startup as Moderna 2.0. And I actually loved the quote from your story where somebody said it was supposed to be Moderna on steroids.
Yeah. Well, the endless RNA, people inside of the company felt was kind of a step above messenger RNA, which we all know is the technology that Moderna has, piloted and kind of brought forward with COVID vaccines. And essentially the big difference scientifically is that messenger RNA is a strand of RNA. And when you insert that strand into the body, it gets eaten up by enzymes that kind of clamp onto each end and chew away at it. And that means that it's really short-lived in the body. We're talking like a day or two, maybe a couple of days of longevity. So Laronde was launched to say, hey, is there a way that we can expand this life cycle of this RNA by actually taking those ends and tying it up into a circle so that those enzymes aren't as able to clamp on to the ends and kind of degrade the RNA. And that was something that, people within the company had really high hopes for. They thought that this would be applicable in, lots of different types of diseases, even chronic diseases, versus, what we've seen so far with messenger RNA, which is, so far it's been most applicable in vaccines.
So, Allison, your story opens in February 2022 with the then CEO asking employees to gather for an all-hands meeting. I know when that happens at Stat, we all get a little bit worried. This was probably the first outward signs of trouble. So what did he tell the staff?
Yeah. So in February 2022, the then CEO, Diego Morales, kind of joined everybody in the company together and said that they had uncovered what they called a bad assay and bad note-taking practices in the company. And at the time, he didn't specifically say, he kind of indicated that like one person was responsible. He didn't say who that person was. But from what I've heard from former employees, like people in the company kind of very quickly put two and two together about who might have been at the center of this issue, because although this was kind of the first outward acknowledged sign of trouble, there had been concern and questions floating around Laronde for almost a year prior to that, around this one scientist and the data that she was producing.
Right. So that scientist, the two and two that people put together, was someone named Catherine Cifuentes Rojas. Why was her work so important within Laronde in the early stages of the company?
Catherine had been brought in, I've been told pretty early into the life cycle of Laronde and kind of quickly was producing like foundational work for the company. Her name is on, a dozen or more patents that are either assigned to Flagship or to Laronde directly. And she had been working on some of the major kind of innovations of this so-called endless RNA, which was, that they believed they could get 30 days of protein production, which is, big compared to that kind of 1 or 2 days that I mentioned with relation to vaccines. And that she could do it without a lipid nanoparticle. And, we all kind of think back to, 2020 when we were all, kind of informing the public or learning more about how messenger RNA worked, it needs to be delivered through these fatty globules to kind of protect it. And, Catherine was producing data that indicated that she could make it work without using those little, fatty globules. And that means, easier to manufacture, possibly like a little bit less of an immune reaction risk. And she was, kind of very integral in the scientists, in the science, I should say, that Laronde was producing and was then pitching to outside investors.
And it's so bonkers reading your story. Just the progression of people trying to replicate her work and what they noticed about it that gave them pause. Maybe just sort of run us through, as those red flags started to rise up, what were they? And then tell us about how management of the company responded.
I'm really grateful to the former employees who spoke to me for this piece. To give you an example, one of the people I spoke to, a woman named Jane Van Heteren, had worked at Laronde, on the same team as Catherine, and was there around, late winter, early spring 2021, and was in meetings when Catherine was presenting this data where, they were showing production of GLP-1, which is now the very popular target for obesity drugs like Wegovy and Mounjaro. And Catherine was presenting this data in lab meetings where she was showing this great, 30-day progression of, protein production. But to Jane, what stood out as odd was that her charts would start at 0, which to Jane didn't make sense because, these experiments were in mice, and mice naturally produce their own GLP-1. So unless these are like very ill mice, or there had been some sort of, retroactive background tweaking to the data, the chart should start, at some point on the axis. When she goes to Catherine won't show her raw data. And she eventually goes to their supervisor, the chief scientific officer at Laronde, who, instead of providing the raw data, criticized Jane. And that was kind of a reoccurring theme in Laronde, that no one was able to see Catherine's raw data. People were struggling to replicate the science that she was producing. And oftentimes there were, kind of excuses or other reasons that were found to, answer the question of like, why can't we reproduce the scientist's data? Now, as we know, in 2022, Laronde executives admit that there was this bad assay, these bad data sets and poor notes that, had been floating around the company for many months.
So you spoke to a lot of people during the reporting of the story. How did they describe Laronde's culture? And I wonder, was there pressure to live up to this hype that had kind of propelled the company forward, like, when these companies sort of come out of stealth?
Yeah, that was a theme that came up with several people that I spoke to kind of throughout Laronde's life cycle. Was, when Laronde launched, they had a very big goal that they put out publicly of producing 100 new medicines in the next decade. And as anybody who has kind of been around biotech for a little while would know, that is a very lofty, ambitious goal. And internally, that was kind of the calling card. And people that I spoke to said that there was pressure to produce results and to produce really positive results. They said that often the staff were criticized. The manufacturing staff came under a lot of fire at various points because they weren't producing enough material at high enough quality. Scientists who worked for the company said that they would sometimes be criticized for, any negative test result that came through. So there was definitely a pressure, in the company that employees felt to kind of live up to the hype.
Well, and then one thing that cuts across through your story, which is so well reported, with all of these people weighing in such detail of how not only this, one issue was playing out, but the sort of like macro pressure and how the company was run. At the same time, the leaders are out there trying to raise money. I mean, if you want to be Moderna 2.0, Moderna 1.0 was quite famous in its private stages, well, for a lot of things, but one of them was raising a lot of venture capital. So how does that kind of cross-cut with what we've been talking about, that at the same time, Laronde is actively marketing itself to investors?
Yeah, I know Damien, how, successful Moderna was at raising money from venture capital folks. At the time that these questions and concerns were kind of floating around, different groups of employees in Laronde in kind of early to mid 2021, the company was then at quite a big valuation. They were a blockbuster company, valued over $1 billion. And an internal slide deck that I was provided with by a source shows big plans as they were to, launch and kind of put forward paperwork to begin clinical trials on all of these, 100 medicines, a really steady growth in their valuation was anticipated over the next several years. So, financially, there were very big goals for this company. When this all kind of came to a head, the company was valued at, multiple $1 billion, according to that slide deck. So it was a very similar, I think, ambition financially compared to Moderna.
So at this point, now they've had to sort of go back to the drawing board and figure out what they're focusing on, given they've had these data issues that sort of underpinned everything they were doing, or a lot of the things that they were doing. So your story notes, they still have a lot of funding, right? But now they're sort of like, a company in search of a mission to apply that funding. It almost kind of reminds me of what's happening with EQRX, where they've got all this money, but their original goal is kind of erased or gone, or they have to sort of reset. But it just kind of makes me wonder, when you have a story like this and you have the big name investors that you noted put tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into this company, do you expect there to be any kind of legal action toward this company?
The legal action I can't speak to yet. Investors have not cared to comment on what's happening with Laronde at this point. I think anything on my part would be speculation. But one thing I do know from, kind of covering the VC industry is that although they wrapped up this round at $440 million, a lot of those big financing rounds will be tranched, will kind of be given in installments. So what I've heard is that Laronde has, kind of executives, as this data issue kind of all unfolded in 2022, reassured employees that it's like, we have enough money in the bank. That's not an issue here. How much money they have left in the bank is unknown. They have, in recent months, laid off a group of employees that they had brought on for clinical manufacturing. The company now says that their ambition is to launch a clinical trial within the next 2 years with new drug candidates. They shelved 2 of their leading drug candidates as this all unfolded. So the question on employees' minds is less about where the finances of the company are and more about what drugs do we have to develop? What drug programs are actually on our pipeline at this point, which I think, Meg, is an appropriate comparison to EQRX.
So when the story came out on Monday, the reaction was like, well, basically it was like, oh, bleep. And people were obviously sharing it on social media, Twitter. It was really well read. One of the interesting things was how many biotech people really felt comfortable sharing your story publicly. This is an industry that tends to close ranks in public. Why do you think that is?
Adam, I admire that you do your own bleep work on this podcast. I have to say,
I'm just saving Teresa the extra work.
I think that to go back to your question, why people kind of call this out publicly, even people within biotech, is that we all know and are very aware of the skepticism of science that's emerged, in the last couple of years, unfortunately fostered by the pandemic and, the anti-vax movement, the question around hype that, kind of was fostered by the whole Theranos situation. I would suspect that people in the biotech industry are well aware of the fact that we as an industry need to, when these situations happen, not kind of bury it under the rug. We need to address it and, hopefully show people, as Jane said at the end of my piece, that this is not what biotech is.
So pivoting back to the speculation aspect of this, one thing that's kind of fascinating in this sort of like meta narrative of Laronde is in doing circular RNA, as you mentioned, the theory is that they would have a better chance at turning RNA into a drug, basically, that could be administered to treat diseases than mRNA companies have had to this point. Moderna about 10 years ago also said it would have 100 drugs in clinical trials and change the world, et cetera, et cetera. Cut to 10 years later, all of Moderna's therapeutic ideas for mRNA are still in phase 1 development. Now, obviously, that doesn't really matter to their business because they've made $1 gazillion with mRNA used for a vaccine. But it did kind of strike me that, is there a potential tension there that Flagship, which founded Moderna, then went on to found a company called Laronde that, maybe internally described as Moderna 2.0. But I think if I were at Moderna 1.0, I might perceive it as a competitor, not just scientifically in that they'd be going after, kind of similar ideas, but also in a practical sense in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If I'm trying to hire the best MR or the best RNA scientists, if I'm Moderna 1.0, I'm suddenly, Moderna 2.0 is out there offering contracts.
Not only is Moderna 2.0 out there in Cambridge trying to hire people, but there are other companies that are developing technology very, very similar to endless RNA called circular RNA. Very similar idea, tying RNA up into an orb into a circle. Laronde Therapeutics is also based in Massachusetts and is once again, they're looking for people with a background in RNA and messenger RNA. So it's created quite an interesting landscape here in Cambridge. Laronde has signed at this point. They have a pharma partnership that's in the works. That is something, Laronde tried to pursue at one point. They were in talks with Pfizer for a partnership. That partnership did not, follow through. That deal didn't get signed. But yeah, if you're an RNA scientist in and around Cambridge, you're made in the shade. You have a lot of job opportunities out there.
Teresa's going to kill me, but I'm going to ask one last question because we are going kind of long. So your mention of Pfizer there really reminded me of, what was happening with Theranos, where they were trying to make these partnerships with pharma companies. And in some cases, the pharma companies declined to continue because they could tell something wasn't right or, the data didn't look good to them. And it sounds like in this situation, Pfizer, it's not clear exactly why Pfizer didn't go with a partnership here, but clearly they didn't. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I think just stepping back, my question reading your story, one of them was, why was this a company at this point if they didn't have the science developed to the extent that they knew, how this was going to work and that it was going to work? And maybe that's not a fair question because a lot of companies are founded at that stage. But what does this kind of say about this boom in VC-backed biotech, particularly for companies at such early stages of science?
Yeah, Meg, I think you kind of alluded to what would be my answer, which is that at the time that this company was getting started, biotech was really on the upturn, and that there were many companies that were being founded and getting early stage financing between 2017 and 2021 that were pursuing really, really, really early stage science. And, as we head into 2021, when Laronde raised this, massive Series B round, we were seeing a lot of really big financings in the biotech industry, really, really hefty amounts of dollars being handed over to biotech companies. As we all know, has been kind of the central annoying theme of biotech over the last 18 months, that has cooled a bit. And I think that I would hope that the industry at large, is thinking about how biotech companies are structured and formed and when you launch them, when you go to raise those big rounds of money. Hopefully, we as an industry will hold ourselves to really high standards there as the years progress.
Allison, it's a great story, and thanks for talking with us about it. And if anyone wants to read that story who has not yet read that story, it is available, obviously, on the digital pages of statnews.com. Allison, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
That does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Berg. And our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether you like your RNA in a straight line or in a circle. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.